All right. Good evening, everyone. Good evening on a lovely fall afternoon here on the campus of Gonzaga University. Welcome to the Flannery Lecture webinar. This is our third semester holding the Flannery event as a webinar panel discussion during our COVID time. So thank you for taking valuable time this evening to discuss to listen to Dr. Anthea Butler, Dr. Cristina, Traina, and Ms. Stacie LeBlanc discuss challenges in Catholic identity, with special reference to three particular challenges: white Christian nationalism, queer theology, and the protection and flourishing of children. My name is John Shoveland. I'm a faculty member here in the Department of Religious Studies. And on behalf of our department, it's my pleasure to say a few words about this lecture series and to introduce our panel of speakers. But first, happy Feast of All Saints. Happy All Saints Day. Our event tonight is taking place on Monday, November 1st, the Feast of All Saints, a day set aside to commemorate the known saints, but also those saints known only to God. This is a day when Catholics pray for and reflect upon the departed, and contemplate the larger communion of which we are all a part. Tomorrow, November 2nd, concludes Dia de los Muertos, a holy day of joyful remembrance originating in Mexico at the confluence of indigenous and Catholic streams of culture, and celebrated well beyond. And since all of November is Native American Heritage Month, we have many reasons to be especially mindful tonight, not only of the Spokane tribal land on which Gonzaga University resides, colonized, unceded, beautiful, polluted land, but the Spokane tribal people and all of the original inhabitants of this region. As would be fitting a feast day of all the saints, let us acknowledge our place and its people. Those who now remain, those who have sought survival these last 200 and so years, and those who belong to a deep historical past spanning millennia, long before the settler colonial project changed everything here. We acknowledge all these people and commit ourselves to new and mindful ways of caring for their land, water, and air. The Flannery Lecture is made possible by the Flannery Endowment, established back in 1973 by Milo and Maud Flannery to promote the study of Catholic theology at Gonzaga. Tonight, we dip into that stream of support 48 years later, grateful for the many ways the Flannery family has contributed to our university life these last almost 5 decades. We have a member, as we always do, of the Flannery family watching tonight, not from the comfort of his own home, but from the comfort of our colleague and friend, the home of Patrick McCormick and Gay Tippett. Good evening, Pat. Good evening, Gay. Michael Flannery. Michael and his husband, Dean Lynch, attend these events unfailingly. Many thanks to Michael and to Dean for the many ways you support Gonzaga and higher education in our region. Thanks for your friendship, and thanks also for the gift of your great aunt and uncle, Milo and Maud, without whose benefaction, almost 50 years ago, we would not be together in this way this evening. So as we gather this evening, we are conscious of deep rifts and divisions in the US Catholic Church, and that these rifts are complex, multifaceted, and in need of further study and attention. Indeed, the rifts are on display not only among lay Catholics of differing sentiment, but among the US bishops themselves, seen in the last several general assemblies of bishops. Catholic identity, or better, Catholic identities, these are a dynamic reality undergoing significant tension and negotiation daily. Our speakers this evening cannot pretend to speak to all of that, but they do offer words of wisdom on particular facets of contested Catholic identity, namely the incoherence of Christian faith and white nationalism, the blind spot in which we minoritize, stigmatize, and fail to accompany and learn from queer Catholics, and queer people in general, and the ongoing need to become a child-centered community of faith. These are our topics of discussion tonight, though it bears mention that these focal points reveal an American bias or an American gaze on Catholic identity. So that Catholic identity in South Asia, for example, would give rise to a very different set of priorities and practices and enculturations, as would Catholic identity in Sao Paulo or Ciudad Juarez or Dublin, Manila, or Lagos. It's worth noting that our approaches to Catholic identity are unavoidably cultural productions, always contextualized, and therefore limited by time and space, and always standing in need of what Pope Francis lately has been calling synodality. Synodality. A synodal church is a church whose members listen deeply to each other, are in dialogue genuinely and authentically with each other, locally and internationally. A synodal church is a church whose members consult each other and make space for practices of rich inclusion, all premised on the fact that all members of the church have something to learn from each other. Indeed, synodality is referred to as a spirituality of journeying together, one that must become an educational principle for the formation of the human person. Listening, dialogue, consultation, inclusion. The Department of Religious Studies at Gonzaga chose these speakers and these topics tonight, convinced that we have something to learn from them. Each of our speakers tonight will speak for about 15 minutes, after which they will engage each other and you, the audience, in conversation. So please know, audience members, you are welcome at any time to write questions into the webinar's Q&A tab, and we will do our best after our third speaker presents. We'll do our best to respond to your remarks. So let's get started. Our first speaker is Dr. Anthea Butler, the Geraldine R. Siegel Professor in American Social Thought at the University of Pennsylvania, where she serves also as chair of the Religious Studies Department. Dr. Butler's writings include scholarly books, such as the two published by the University of North Carolina Press, White Evangelical Racism, The Politics of Morality in America. That's her first. And the second is Women in the Church of God in Christ, Making a Sanctified World. Her writings also include a number of commentary and opinion pieces for CNN, MSNBC, I think that was last week, right, Anthea? MSNBC, PBS, the History Channel, and others. She is the epitome of a public-facing scholar. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Anthea Butler.
Let me get myself unmuted so that I can do this right. You would think after a year and a half, you would get the unmute button right? Thank you for having me, first of all, John Cleveland. Thank you so much for Gonzaga Religious Studies. Thank you to the Flannery Lectures and everyone for what I hope is going to be a good conversation, although I have to say that it is going to be a tough conversation. So hopefully I'm going to have the ability to share my screen here with you. And I want to start off by starting with a bishop. And I think that is going to maybe get to all of you. Hopefully you can all see this. As fate would have it, this morning I woke up and I was thinking about my talk, and Bishop Strickland of Tyler, Texas, gave me something to talk about today. And this is the tweet that he had. And I hadn't seen this before, but I saw it come across my timeline. And so I just want to read it to you, and then I'm going to set up what this is about. All we need to do is to listen to this speech. Freedom is the right to do what we ought. Jim Caviezel, historic speech, and the storm is upon us at the video Patriot Double Down in Las Vegas media. Now, I'm not going to play this video for you because I'm going to talk about it, but I want to say something about the bishop actually chiming in on this particular thing, because I think it's really important and it sets up the stage for what I want to talk about today about Catholics and white nationalism. If we think about the history of Catholicism, we all know that the way that Catholics come into this country are various and sundry ways, but most of the time we came in as immigrants, okay? My family is fifth generation Catholic because of slavery. But for some of you, you probably came in as an immigrant family. Someone from your family came from Eastern Europe or someplace else and settled here, or you might be a convert, you might be something else. So you might be thinking, what does this have to do with white nationalism? What does Catholicism have to do with white nationalism? Well, a little bit of everything. And it's unfortunate because what happened and what has been happening within the Catholic Church is a shift to the very, very right, and a shift that has not encompassed what traditional Catholic teaching has been. And I need to talk about this in the context of evangelicalism, because here I want to refer to someone who has been really useful and thoughtful for me to tie off of, and that's Antonio Spadaro, who's a Jesuit, who is also a journalist in Rome. And back in 2017, he wrote an article called A Surprising Ecumenism, where he talked about the overlays between Catholic thought and thinking in terms of freedom and nationalism and kinds of ways in which Catholics were settling themselves alongside of evangelicals, especially in the United States. And what he talked about was the warlike and militant approach that seemed attractive to these kinds of Catholics, the kinds of Catholics that before we would have talked about peace and all of these things, but they also are going into a way in which that they are picking up on language that is militant, language that is violent, language that is fraught with fights for freedom. And so one of the things I think that we have to sort of consider is the ways in which Catholics, and at least in the United States, and we could think about this in terms of Ukraine and others, but I don't have time to get into that today. If we think about this in terms of what is happening right now in the United States with movements like QAnon, 1-6 insurrection, and others, we can begin to see how groups, Catholic lay groups like Church Militant and others, have been drawn to this kind of language and why they have been drawn to this language. And so Caviezel's talk that Bishop Strickland referred to is an important piece in all of this because of what he says. And I want to read a little bit of this speech that he gave because I think it's really important to put this in a framework. Now, if you don't know who Jim Caviezel is, he played Jesus in the Passion of the Christ by Mel Gibson. My way of knowing about Jim Caviezel was through one of the priests that I knew at my first job at Loyola Marymount, who actually served as a person who worked on the film with Mel Gibson in terms of the Aramaic language and everything else. And so Caviezel has been sort of a figure in conservative Catholicism, but this appearance at this QAnon conference was really important. And he takes words from Mel Gibson's speech in Bravehearts and put them into this kind of Catholic world. So I want to quote this. He moves out of the script and says, "We must fight for that authentic freedom and live, my friends. By God, we must live, and with the Holy Spirit as your shield in Christ, as your sword, may you join Saint Michael and all the other angels in defending God and sending Lucifer and his henchmen straight back to hell where they belong." Now, I don't have to tell you, you're going to see this in the next couple of clips, who Lucifer really is. Lucifer is anybody who disagrees, or anybody who disagrees with where the country has gone, or the fact that Donald Trump did not win the election, okay? And one of the things that Antonio Spadaro says about this kind of language, that it has a way in which it missionizes people. It makes you have to go through things. You have to be willing to fight. And this idea about freedom and how we talk about freedom folds into white nationalism, especially now with what has happened during the 1-6 insurrection. Here is a picture from that day. You see the cross, you see the Trump America sign, Keep America Great Again. There's some flags that are in the back. And I haven't shown the most violent pieces of this, but I want to talk about 1-6 as not just an insurrection against the government in order to keep Donald Trump in power. It was more than that. It was not just an insurrection. It was basically a white supremacist insurrection that had religious overtones and religious foundations to it. What people have not paid attention to, and what has been hard for those of us who are religion scholars who study this, is to actually help people understand the religious undertones of what happened here at the at insurrection, and also what happened in the lead up to the insurrection. Most of you probably have not paid attention to this news, but there were religious meetings that were happening in December of 2019 into 2020 into 2021 that were all going into how people needed to think about this, pushing towards violence, pushing towards the way in which to categorize anybody that was not conservative, anyone who was not white or into white supremacy, into a box that basically said, here are people who are not for us and also not for freedom. And so if you put this all together with what happened on 1/6, and also in the ways in which we've had to think about what has happened since then with the coronavirus, this language about freedom and how freedom has been appropriated has taken on a different meaning. For those of you who've been paying attention politically to the US Conference of Catholic Bishops, you'll know that every year for the past 10 to 12 years, there has been a fortnight for freedom at the end of June of every year, where it leads up to the 4th of July, which is the ultimate day, and how they talk about freedom in terms of religious freedom. This talk has shifted. And the way that it has shifted is into talking about how freedom comes not just through the ways in which people are able to worship, but the ways in which people are able to exert their rights in particular kinds of ways, and how that dovetails with the ways in which they thought about Donald Trump, how Donald Trump gave them everything they wanted in terms of judges, in terms of thinking about and privileging Christians, and also in terms of the ways in which he talked about other peoples. And this is where it becomes most troubling, as you know, because of the way that Catholics mostly have come into this country and the backlash against immigrants that has happened. Now, that's not to say that everybody is there, but I want you to listen to this next clip that I'm going to show you. But first, I want to talk about of Father David Fulton, who is from Omaha, Nebraska. He was at the 1/6 insurrection. And I'm just going to stop my screen for a minute so that I can show you this video, because it's really important for you to understand the kind of rhetoric that Spadaro is talking about that has weaponized the Catholic Church in a certain way. And hopefully you'll be able to hear this, so you might want to turn up your sound a little bit. But this is a clip from that day and the clip of this priest being interviewed. I won't play it all, but I want to talk about what he says.
What was it like in there? What was it like for you in there?
Pretty awesome. Yeah. I wouldn't get way up there, but the crowd was awesome. The atmosphere. It's good to see so many people who care about the country, concerned about the country, people who know what's going on, the obvious deal, and hopefully we'll be able to take this into our local communities and do something. I think the preference of sports, where you have sports fans, they say what we're going to do when we're not on the field, but we can't be spectating. We need to be doing something individually. We need to be taking whatever platforms we have and make our country better.
Now, what kind of prayers have you had people of faith been saying? Because it didn't seem to help Trump at all. What happened? Why did God abandon Trump?
God hasn't abandoned Trump. People have free will, and they have a bunch of people going on still. So God doesn't abandon us, but God does ultimately conquer.
Now, God was on Trump's side, right?
Yeah, God's on the side of the good. So we need to be on God's side. And we all need to be on God's side. We all need to be on God's side.
I want to stop that there. We need to be on God's side. And that becomes very important when you start to think about what actually happened on 1/6 and how that was portrayed to everyone in this kind of milieu. This priest was actually reprimanded by the Diocese of Omaha, Nebraska, for what he did. But it's also a problem because he showed up in his collar. He talked about what people should be doing. This is how people are being weaponized. And I could give a whole spiel about what happened before the election in 2020, about how we had Catholic priests talking about Biden was the Antichrist and inserting themselves into the election, or saying things about Black Lives Matter and everything else. What am I saying here? And I only have a little bit of time left, so I wanted to show you one more thing, because I think this will tell the tale about where Catholics are right now. This chart comes from PRI Institute, discrimination against whites has just become a big of a problem as discriminations against Black Americans or other minorities. This is 2015 to 2020 by white subgroups. I want to point you where my cursor is to white Catholics and how that number has increased or decreased a little bit, actually, from September 2019, where you see the color codes, to October 2015 to June 2020. This is a pretty high number that 51% of Black Catholics believe that they have discrimination problems just as much as Black people. So what does this say to us? What does it say about what is happening in the American church right now? And I want to stop here because I want to say a few points that I hope will help you sort of frame where we are about this conversation, and at least where I am about this conversation. I think there are three things. One is I have made a statement, and people have asked me, what did I mean by this? But I'll be a little bit clearer and say that American Catholicism has unfortunately become co-opted by American evangelicalism. What I mean by that is the political activities of evangelicals that also involve white supremacy has also come into the American Catholic realm. And it doesn't help that we have had fights about communion. It doesn't help that we've had people critique Pope Francis and say that Benedict is really their Pope. All of these things are of a piece. And part of that has to do with where we are in terms of nationalism in this country. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I think it's really important to interrogate the ways in which Catholics have not been able to deal with their own racial issues within their communities, within their parishes, and on the level of the bishops. We have had all these sorts of statements in the 1980s and beyond. The last statement came out about 3 years ago, and there was supposed to be a big thing that came out about that. That has not really happened. We are wrestling in the Catholic Church with race and racism, and we have to begin to find ways to really talk about this. I think the third thing, and one of the most important things, is the way that Catholics are dealing with the immigration issue. And I think this is where white supremacy trips people up in certain kinds of ways. The immigration issue for a lot of bishops is important because we have people who are right now in churches that make up the bulk of some of our Catholic churches and parishes who are from immigrant communities. At the same time, there are issues like on my home state of Texas, at the Texas border, where you send back all the Haitians and you send back certain immigrants, but you don't send back other immigrants, or you send back everyone en masse, or they're treated and separated from their families. And this kind of rhetoric about immigrants being dirty and carrying disease and not being worthy to come into the country all play into white supremacy. And unfortunately, we have Catholics who think this way and use these same kinds of issues. And so what I want to do today is sort of prompt your thinking in this short period of time to think about the ways in which white supremacy and issues of evangelicals have come into American Catholicism and muddied the waters for us in such a way where we are having these internecine battles and not being able to get back to what I believe would help us to right the ship and help us to get rid of some of the sectarianism that has been happening within our ranks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Butler. We know from the Pew Forum, there's plenty of data to back up some of these comments that you're offering, to be sure. Thanks so much. Before we move on, just a quick reminder that folks are welcome to put questions and comments into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So feel free at any point in time to drop those in. To do so in real time is just fine. Our panelists can see them, and when we are finished with our third speaker, we'll then turn to conversation between them and with you all. So thanks for that. Okay, moving on to our next speaker. Our second speaker this evening is Dr. Cristina Traina, the Avery Dulles S.J. Chair in Catholic Theology at Fordham University, and previously on the faculty at Northwestern University. She has served on a variety of journal editorial boards and as a board member and president of the Society of Christian Ethics. Her two books are Erotic Attunement, Parenthood and the Ethics of Sensuality Between Unequals, University of Chicago Press, 2011. And the second book, Feminist Ethics and Natural Law, The End of the Anathemas, Georgetown University Press, 1999. Her current book project is called Children Out of Place and Moral Agency, in which she studies 4 sites in which children are out of place, including those who work for pay, children who work for pay, children who migrate, unaccompanied children, those rescued by armies and gangs, and children active in labor movements and politics, and finally, children who must decide how to respond to intersex or transgender identity. And that is where she'll be picking up with us this evening. So please welcome Dr. Traina.
Good evening and thanks for having me. It's an honor to be here with these really stellar colleagues. And what I'm going to undertake today is maybe a little bit different because I took my title very literally. You'll see in a minute that I was assigned by John, and I am very grateful to have an extremely different sort of take to give you than Professor Butler did. Her message is important. I hope that we can get to the center of it. Yet I think I have some good news with my little talk, because I believe that we have the possibility of maybe not even needing to discuss the issue of queer theology and Catholic identity, that it's solved. I apologize that I cannot get to the part of the screen that allows me to give a slideshow. So you're going to have to deal with all of the all of the notes here. Okay, so I am addressing 2 phenomena that people think are antithetical: queer theology and Catholic identity. And what I'm going to say is going to feel extremely obvious to some people, especially if you're queer or have studied queer theory. And it's going to be jarringly unfamiliar and maybe even sound heretical to other people. So journey with me and we can discuss it more during the question period. This comes about because of all of Pope Francis's attacks on gender theory that seem to make queer theology impossible because of any starting point that blurs the lines between masculinity and femininity, or proposes alternatives to heterosexual marriage would seem to be dead in the water because it's outside the boundaries of our doctrinal formulas, what we think we know to be true of God and God's clear intentions for humanity. But in fact, as theologian Patrick Cheng argued about 10 years ago, Christian theology itself is fundamentally queer enterprise. Orthodox Catholic theology is essentially irrevocably queer, and so is a lively Catholic identity. What do I mean by this? I'm going to spend most of my time on the first point with the hope of unfolding the second a little more in our conversation. I'm going to define theology and queer theology. I'll spend most of my energy on my case that historical, authentic, Orthodox Catholic theology is and must be queer. I'll touch on cultural and historical factors that have caused Catholics in the global North to depart from this traditional view. And I'll explore briefly, very briefly, what I mean by the claim that Catholic identity is queer. So, St. Anselm's basic definition of theology is still mine: faith seeking understanding. Or if you like, theology is our attempt to express our experience of God in human words and concepts that are familiar to us and to our companions in the faith in our time and place. So right away, we have to be cautious. God is a reality that is infinitely close to us, but is also infinitely other. By nature, God cannot be fully grasped intellectually or described precisely in human language. This is probably why so many words are written about God, because no matter how many words we write, they're still inadequate. To think that we can reduce God to a being whom we can capture in the limited terms of human language would be idolatry. Mystery is at the heart of theology, a too muchness that we can never master because God is divine and we are human. We can sense it occasionally, but we can experience it fully only when we meet God face to face. So theology is an exercise in putting asterisks besides every word that we write. Words don't mean the same way when they refer to God as they do when they refer to ordinary tangible reality. Another way to say this is theology is more like poetry, with almost infinite connotations that carry our minds beyond the literal text, than like a philosophical or mathematical formula. To be queer means to inhabit the tensions between two poles of identity in such a way that we draw on both without fully being either, in a way that changes how we think of both and may even create a third way of being. To be gay or lesbian is to be male or female, but by loving in an unexpected way, transgress heterosexual tropes of masculinity and femininity, which insist that opposite sex attraction and complementarity are essential parts of our gender identity. To be non-binary is not to erase gender, but to inhabit both genders fluidly, destabilizing what seem to be firmly delineated sets of masculine and feminine characteristics. To be intersex is to have both genders inhabiting oneself, again in contradiction to the rules of gender distinction. To be trans has many meanings, but one of the most common is to embrace one's true gender without entirely abandoning the body or the memory of one's dead gender. It's to retain a bothness because one's identity is to be in motion from one pole to the other. Queer theology, and I'm sorry I couldn't find the graphic that has the black and brown stripes in it, or the trans stripes either, and a cross. Queer theology has lots of definitions too. It could be theology done by queer people. It could be theology that reinterprets the Christian past through a queer liberation lens. But the most basic description of queer theology is theology that draws on the identity-bending experience of gay, lesbian, bi, trans, intersex, non-binary, and all other queer lives, to fearlessly explore the both and neither character of all God language without trying to get rid of the tensions and apparent contradictions. Queer theology holds space for God precisely in these tensions and contradictions. Boundary and category crossing is at the center of the queer theological project because it leaves room for the infinite, incomprehensible, and yet close mystery of God. Historically, the Christian tradition in theology has been queer to its core. Its basic tools are figures of speech that point beyond themselves. One precedent is scripture. For instance, the parables of the shepherd who seeks out his lost sheep and the woman who overturns her house to find a lost coin are allegories, fictions that hint indirectly at God's infinitely greater love and care for each of God's beloved. Scriptural authors also use analogies. God is like a father or a mother hen or a signal fire or refreshing water or all of these at once, but none of them literally. Then there's metaphor. The God who nags and reprimands Jonah and relents from punishing the city of Nineveh, as if God were a fickle person who spoke in ordinary ways and granted and withdrew support on a whim. Finally, there's apophatic theology, which holds the door to mystery open through negation. God is not a wind or an earthquake or a fire or a person or any event to which we can put language. God exceeds all of these. God is the only indescribable phenomenon. Nearly all the doctrines at the core of our faith depend on our being able to believe that a thing holds two contradictory characteristics simultaneously in such a way that each characteristic is transformed or remade or queered by the other one. The first 6 ecumenical councils were efforts over centuries to describe Jesus, the Trinity, the Mother of God in human language. The Christological controversies ask, how can Jesus be both divine and human? They eventually rejected both the idea that Jesus was a human being who eventually was adopted or inspired, because that would mean he was missing his divinity, or that he was God walking around in human costume. That would mean he was missing his humanity. Yet if Jesus is both human and divine, where is the boundary? What is the relationship? What does he know? What is life like inside his head? When applied to Jesus, the categories divine and human can't retain their normal sense. The mystery of Jesus Christ bursts out of them. Likewise for the Trinity. What happens to language when God, who is not a person, is also three persons who manifest in radically different ways, and yet is one unified essence? The words three and one and person mutually transform each other, departing from their normal grammatical meanings in our very process of deploying those meanings. And what about the Mother of God? She delivers a paradoxical virgin birth. Her partner in conception is the ungendered Holy Spirit, but her spouse is human. She is said to be fully human, but like no other human, conceived without sin, and she's assumed into heaven. She's not a goddess. She's a fleshly person, but she's not a human being in the normal sense of the word either. Her brush with divinity has altered or queered her humanity. Historically, devotional theology has been even queerer than dogmatic theology. It's perhaps not surprising that medieval nuns envisioned themselves as the rapturous brides of Christ, but men too envisioned themselves as Christ's brides by gendering their own souls female, with the result that their identity was in a way non-binary, both male and female, and their ecstatic union with the bridegroom was simultaneously heteroerotic and homoerotic. Bernard of Clairvaux's vision of drinking the blood that flowed from Christ's wounds as if it were milk flowing from his breasts bends both age and gender. Jesus is simultaneously male and female. Bernard is the infant nursing at the breast of his mother or brother, or he is an adult, gendered male, with a female soul. This ambiguity produces simultaneous homo and heteroerotic connotations and head-spinning permutations. And desire for God is queer anyway. The mystics speak of the rapture of the soul's body. The same is true for sacramental theology. At the consecration, the bread and wine of the Eucharist are transformed into the body and blood of Christ. Christ's body and blood are queered or refigured so as to be invisibly present in the species of bread, under the species of bread and wine. The bread and wine in turn both are and are not themselves. The bread looks and tastes like bread, but is Christ's body and must be kept in the tabernacle and reverenced. And the wine looks and tastes like wine, but is Christ's blood. In that case, how do we get to the pass where queer theology seems to be a threat to orthodoxy? Caution, gross overgeneralization ahead. As we know, under the influence of the Enlightenment, the Northern and Western cultures began to view knowledge as data observed by the five senses and or derived deductively from self-evident foundations, leading to logical conclusions. Under the influence of philosophers of that period, very much like the four horsemen of atheism more recently, mystery began to lose its connotation as an ineffable reality that grounds being. Mystery became the as yet unexplored territory at the edge of the map, not fundamentally different from known reality, just a label for information that we don't know yet or we choose not to investigate. With the Reformation, Protestants and Catholics both took the Christian proclivity for statements of faith, like creeds, to new extremes, at times creating modern scientific theologies of formulaic propositions and conclusions. They sometimes saw theology as something like a mathematical proof, reason from proven premises, to ever more precisely worded, universally and eternally valid conclusions. In the Roman Catholic Church, this also meant reinterpreting medieval scholastic summae as systematic proofs, rather than what they truly were, debates or scripts of debates committed to paper. Of course, this movement was not unanimous. Romantics and mystics popped up on both sides of the Reformation divide. But with regard to doctrine, on the Catholic side, statements that before had been ineluctably queer and poetic often hardened into one-dimensional literal assertions. The classic case is Paul's vision of Christ as bridegroom and the church as bride. Here's an artistic rendition of it. In Roman Catholic teaching, this image has been transmuted from simply one metaphor among many to doctrine. As Susan Ross has written, the metaphor genders the church feminine, a fitting marital partner to the male Christ. It draws on the ancient social truth that most women derive their livelihood and their social standing entirely from their husbands, to indicate that love and power and grace flow in one direction, from Christ to the church, which depends on him for life. It also implies that to image Christ's masculinity in these nuptials, priests must be men. And this is held to be literally true, without a shred of queer doubleness, even though the vision of marriage at its center contradicts contemporary church teaching on men's and women's equal dignity and partnership in marriage. It also serves as an argument against same-sex marriage, because two men or two women cannot properly reflect the bride-bridegroom marital image of Christ in the church, which all married persons are called to display, and on which the church apparently, according to this way of stating the doctrine, literally depends in order to maintain its own identity as bride of Christ. Now that's a gender theory. It's not hard to see how this one-dimensional reasoning differs from queer doctrines I mentioned earlier. And yet, humorous irony breaks through even this woodenly rationalized doctrine. As Frank DiBernardo of New Ways Ministry points out, many who image Christ in the Eucharist are gay men who choose ordination in part because it gives them permission to exercise more feminine virtues, like caring for other people, dealing with emotions, and not least a strong emphasis on spirituality. Queered again. Last summer, the Catholic lesbian author Eve Tushnet wrote that to be human is to embrace the queer and Catholic paradox of simultaneous shame, glamour, defeat, and brazenness, and of a religious life made of pathways that seem to negate their own destinations. The rose, she says, is the queer Catholic symbol par excellence. With its heavy perfume, its skin-piercing thorns, it is as glamorous as everything that hurts us, as painful as everything that frees us. It is a sign of a Catholic identity that is simultaneously flower and thorn, and neither flower nor thorn, essentially and always queer. We can talk about this a little bit later on.
Thank you, Dr. Traina. Thank you so much. Our third and final speaker, and our speakers can kindly note the number of questions popping up in the Q&A tab. We will get to those in just a few moments. But our final and third speaker is Ms. Stacie LeBlanc, a lawyer who began her career 30 years ago as a child abuse prosecutor in the county of Jefferson Parish, Louisiana. She received an Outstanding Prosecutor Award for her unit's 94% conviction rate. Currently, Stacie has a variety of leadership roles, including serving as the president of the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children, APSAC, also as a member of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops National Review Board, which is a lay consultative body that advises the bishops on child and youth protection. And she serves on the National Initiative to End Corporal Punishment. She is co-founder of the UP Institute. The UP Institute is a think tank helping to train people to move upstream to solve child abuse. and she is the founding director of the New Orleans Children's Advocacy Centers, as well as the Audrey Hepburn Care Center. Ms. LeBlanc teaches regularly on the prevention of child sexual abuse. Please join me in welcoming Stacie LeBlanc.
Thank you. I'm Stacie LeBlanc, and thank you, Dr. Shivlin, and thank you, the voices that we just heard, the poetry that was spoken by Dr. Traina and by Dr. Butler. It was so inspiring. I'm so honored to be here tonight and share with you something that is so meaningful to me. One of the things that's not in my bio, and I feel like I need to state, is when we're talking about challenges in Catholic identity, I was faced with this pretty early on in my career. I got out of law school after graduating from Catholic law school, starting Catholic kindergarten, Catholic grammar school, Catholic middle school, Catholic high school. And after graduating, also getting my master's in early childhood development, it was pretty early on in my career in the state of Louisiana that the first case that most note as being prosecuted and then civilly brought to justice occurred in Lafayette Parish. And it was always a challenge, as we're talking about challenges in Catholic identity, for me to be growing as a professional, 10 years doing prosecution, 19 years running a medical program and a CAC, and then nationally working in this field. Many, many times I'm challenged about how I can do this in the face of what's going on in the Catholic Church with the sex abuse scandal. But it was always interesting to me, and I just wanted to start with one anecdote, that the first case that I tried, my Catholic identity showed up, and it was actually in this particular case in 1991. There was not a dry eye on a juror, and in less than 10 minutes, they came back and held a father accountable for the aggravated rape that he had committed on both of his children. And the jury foreman in this case said it would take Jesus Christ to come into the courtroom and bail him out, and he didn't show up. And it became apparent to me that in a community, in a large Catholic community as the New Orleans metropolitan area, that my faith was a part of this. But I was equally challenged, and I think many of us have been challenged as Catholics with understanding the crisis that has occurred, and many don't even realize it did start in Louisiana. But what I want to focus on today is not just what we have done downstream to try to prevent the atrocities that have occurred at the hand of some clergy, but to also point out that there's a positive legacy that many of us as professionals across this country, nationally and internationally, have been able to learn from the church, hopefully never to make the same mistakes, but to understand that this problem crosses all religions, all races, all sexual orientations, and all socioeconomic. We have found that one of the first things that had to happen that I did as a young prosecutor was go to the Louisiana legislature, and we changed our statute of limitation. The majority of the cases that have occurred that make children vulnerable have been delayed. The average time that John Jay studies and all of the studies that were done that the National Review Board actually founded to get that done is that 20 to 30 years is the time that it's delayed. But in order to hold someone accountable, that time, usually the statute of limitation in each state has passed. So we passed laws in Louisiana so that we could go back and hold accountable perpetrators who have done these sins in so many years prior. One of the things I think is important to note as we're talking about this and as it relates to our Catholic identity is that child sexual abuse, the prevalence of child sexual abuse, the CDC is sticking with 1 in 4 girls before the age of 18, 1 in 6 boys before the age of 18. One of the positive legacies is that because of programs like Darkness to Light and Virtuous and Peridium that many of you have probably gone through Safe Environment Coordinators and throughout this community, we now show that 94% of Catholics who are in any way engaged in church activities, volunteer activities, and school have gone through these programs. Because of that, these programs, we now recognize that child sexual abuse has been brought down to 1 in 10. Now, when we compare that to other phenomena that impact kids, that's 19 times more common than intellectual disabilities, which we used to call retardation, 30 times more common than child autism, 75 times the rate of childhood cancer. I often ask the question, if I was with you in a live audience, that, when we talk about cancer, breast cancer, and I'll ask folks, what is the color of breast cancer? Everyone, what is the ribbon that people wear? What are the color of the tennis shoes? Everyone will know that it's pink. But when we think about it, it's 75 times more common than children are being impacted by child sexual abuse than childhood cancer. And I'll ask, what is the color of the prevention of child sexual abuse? And many people don't know. Now, we'll give you a hint. It's always the color of my slides. It's the bright royal blue. It represents, in some ways, the bruises, the black and blue bruises that children incur from child abuse. But we now recognize that child sexual abuse is declining to 1 in 10. And yet we still have to account for the fact that as Catholics, as theologians, we have to account for the fact that there was a huge surge in what's been reported. And no matter how we look at it across all fields and across all studies. So the core findings from the John Jay study recognize that this huge surge occurred in the 70s and it has declined. So many people are celebrating, well, look, it's brought it down. But we have to note that even when we've looked at these trends among other studies, such as the Australian study, the CARA study, and other studies, and even the Bishop's Accountability website, we have to recognize that there was a very large number, and the Bishop's Accountability takes that number to 20,000 children who were impacted by childhood sexual abuse at the hand of clergy. When we look at the amount of priests and clergy who were committing those crimes against children, we have to also recognize and step back and recognize that while it originally was thought to be 4%, it is now at a generous point thought to be 5.9%. That still means that 94% of priests have not, based on all of these compilation of studies. But at the same time, one of the travesties within the church hasn't been the sinner who has committed the crime against the child, but has been the turning the blind eye to the abuse that is occurring to children across the country. So one of the negative pieces of this legacy is it's reinforced stereotypes. It's reinforced these stereotypes that celibacy is somehow totally to blame, or homosexuality, or that pedophile priest. And yet the reality is that we know, just like in the case of Jerry Sandusky, and I like to use this case rather than naming a bishop or a priest, because we need to recognize that there have been travesties within other institutions, wonderful academic institutions like Penn State. But we now recognize that Jerry Sandusky was not a pedophile. He was a hebephile. It was somebody that was attracted to kids at puberty. We recognize, looking back, that in the clergy crisis, many of them were hebephiles also, and less than 5% were pedophiles. We also recognize that there were multiple children that were hurt at the hands of some individual priests, and there were also single cases. But I want to take a second to point out the positive legacy. What have we learned? There's nothing positive about a child being impacted by child sexual abuse, but it has alerted all of us to stop the silence, to spread light where there's darkness, and to talk, for parents to talk, for communities to talk, to be suspicious. And that is a part of bringing down this crisis. The media that has been focused on this, and it is because of programs that come through the Safe Environment, where they're minimizing one-on-one, that we really do believe that the number of children who are being sexually abused at the hands of clergy has reduced significantly. And that is a very incredible piece that we can take apart in this accountability. Now, the US CCB, the National Review Board, they're doing everything they can on a daily basis. But we also need to understand that these impacts to kids are horrendous. long-term, we have discovered critical links to long-term health impact by children who've been sexually abused. This isn't something where you can get over it. And so if you haven't heard about it, I want to encourage you to look at the ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, that show where Dr. Anthea and Dr. Felitti found these correlations to long-term. It is possibly considered the biggest public health survey ever impacted in showing this link, this critical link. And we know that this toxic stress can get under the skin and cause long-term harm. And that it can change actually the brain. It changes the little tip at the end of the DNA. They've been shown study after study that it shortened the telomeres, which is sort of just like that little plastic piece on the end of a shoelace. When it starts to unravel, so does the shoelace. It changes the DNA. And so there's an epigenetic impact. So what can we do? Well, we can do many things. What we can't do is we can't bubble wrap our children. We can't hold them back from experiences and being around people, but we can limit one-on-one. We can stop covering it up because it doesn't heal. And we can also recognize that from the ACEs study, that there is an incredible bounty of research that is coming through to show that people can bounce forward. Now, we can get the trauma-focused therapy that we know, the cognitive behavioral trauma-focused therapy that can wipe away the triggers so that we don't have the long-term impacts. And we can also do things to nourish the soul and to bring back. And one of the things I like to point out is that when we recognize the ACEs, one of the ACEs that I would think is clearly an adverse childhood experience is having the death of a parent. And yet when we look at that, is not correlated with the long outcomes that we see with child sexual abuse. And they started wondering, like, what's the difference? And one of the key researchers in this said they looked at it and they studied it and they said, well, think about it. What happens when a child loses a parent? What happens in the community? What happens when that child goes to school? They're embraced, they're hugged, they're looked at. Everyone says, I'm so sorry that happened to you. What happens when that same child maybe has a parent who goes to jail or has been sexually abused and people know? Do they sometimes know? Yes. But instead, it's shame and silence. And, you know, I always like to say to folks, what happens in your church community? There are casseroles. The difference is in child sexual abuse, there is shame and silence. And so each of you can make a huge difference by providing that social support and providing those hugs. So I'm not in any way trying to minimize this and say, if we just make casseroles, we can make it go away. But we can certainly have a big piece. And I want you to know that there is a huge growing sense of research, a growing body of research on the importance of faith, religion, and spirituality for victims of child maltreatment. And we're now putting on our CACs, our Children's Advocacy Centers, chaplaincy programs. And these studies are actually showing that they think one of the single most important pieces for some children is increasing their faith connection. Some people feel harmed, spiritually harmed. At the same time, I want to make sure that I am clear that there are some things that are so harmful and we shouldn't do. What we can do is we can talk about it and we can shed light, but we have to stop asking why they didn't tell. We have to accept, as all the studies have shown us, they rarely tell immediately. We also need to recognize three things. I often hear people say, well, this happens in other churches. Yes, it does. But that does not make it better. It doesn't make it okay. Parents know this for young teenagers, young adolescents, and latency age. You know, if a child says everybody's doing it, that doesn't make it okay. And this is a grave sin that's being committed to children and causing long-term harm. So pointing out that everyone else is doing it does not in any way minimize it. The other thing we have to recognize is that we have to understand that not, in addition to pointing out that it's happened in other religions doesn't minimize, we also need to recognize that pointing out that it happens mainly in homes, and that is true. We know that 60% of sex abuse occurs in that child's home, but 22% of the overall is occurring in youth serving organizations, and clergy are responsible for that. So we have to be careful. And the gravest sin that may be happening right now is happening at the advice of attorneys. And I am an attorney at the core. I use those skills as best I can to advocate for children, but the bankruptcy and the pieces that are happening to hide money from survivors is possibly one of the greatest sins that is occurring. And we need to ask ourselves, is it time to follow our heart, to follow what we know is wrong and make it right and pay back the sins? Or are we going to try to protect the church and protect the money? So I want to invite each and every one of you to join us at the intersectionality of faith, religion, and spirituality. APSAC is sponsoring this, and I would love to, I'll put in the chat in the question about how you can be involved to be a spiritual leader as we try to bring the feeling of transparency to this. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Stacie. APSAC is a wonderful organization and extraordinarily productive. My email inbox every day, new things coming from APSAC. So yeah, thanks for that recommendation. Wonderful. Thanks to all three of you for this stimulating set of reflections. We have different topics here, and yet there might be ways to interweave these together a bit. But we have a variety of questions. 12 now, and just now we're getting some questions for Stacie, since you're the third speaker. Anthea, you can probably see the ones directed toward yourself, and Cristina, you've got a couple, I think, to do with biblical studies. So let me first of all inquire as to whether the three of you would offer any feedback, comments, observations across each other's talks. And then maybe we can get directly into the audience's not easy questions that have been pitched your way. So any observations from the three of you across each other's talks, or should we get straight to the audience? Anthea, you're muted.
I think all I would just say is, thanks to all of you for really great observations and talks. And just to say that while it doesn't look like any of this is related, it actually is. It actually is related to authoritarianism. And I think it's really important to set that out on the table, because that is something that we have to deal with within the church, even though we have a hierarchy and authority and theology and all of that. The ways in which that can be distorted is one way that all of these things fall apart and break apart. So I think that's really important to say as a foundational piece to all of our talks today.
Thank you. Okay, so straight to the audience then. I mean, there are some questions for clarification, like the "Why did God abandon Trump?" question.
Yeah, I can put that in the chat so you can listen to it, because there's not a transcript on the side of it, although it was up on the screen. Basically, there was somebody who was interviewing the priest and said, well, why did God abandon Trump? And then he kind of said he didn't really abandon Trump. I think what's important about that clip, and I want to put this in the context of also talking about the bishop, which is somebody asked that question a minute ago, is that clergy are playing a big role in this. And I think this is really huge to actually consider the fact that the people who we are trusting, as Catholics to be, Christ's representative on earth are also representing other things. And when we see that they are representing other things, we have to call those things out. And that is the reason why I showed this, because in part, this is something that the diocese really came against him for, and they basically made him apologize. He shouldn't have been there in the first place. Collar on or collar off. I think that's really important to say, first of all. And then secondarily, this has been going on in parishes for a while now, just as much as is going on in evangelical churches, where people express their opinions from the pulpit, during a homily or any way else, where they say you should vote for a certain person. And, obviously, I'm not naive enough to think that we actually do have separation of church and state in this country. But the fact of the matter is that a lot of people are not only getting their ideas about what the nation is and what the government is from places like the news or Facebook or anything else, they're getting it from their local parish priest. And if their local parish priest is showing up on 1/6 at the insurrection, then I have to ask, what is going on? How is it that a priest can get on a plane and go up here and climb up the Capitol steps with everybody else and say, well, I didn't go in, but it was a good time. And oh, by the way, I exorcised some demons while I was there. That's not even Catholic theology. It's just not. And so I think that we need to start really calling this stuff out. Somebody asked me in the chat, what do I plan to do about this? I'm like, I'm the writer, I'm the academic. I talk about this stuff all the time. I think we have a conference of Catholic bishops that, quite frankly, I'm going to say this in front of everybody here. It's a Jesuit school, you're not going to throw me out. That, the Conference of Catholic Bishops is more concerned with looking political right now than they are with doing the work of God. And, hopefully somebody's here, they'll go back and say it, that I said it. Because I really think that we are at a crisis point, and if we allow these kinds of things to create a schism in the American church, we're not going to come back from that. We are at a precipice right now in this country, and I think that the church can help us think about the way that we need to be, but at the same time, we need to confront the people within our own ranks who are trying to create schism, not just in the church, but nationally.
I wonder, Christy, if we might move to the question, question around the interpretation of Paul and the Johannine literature. This was the anonymous attendee at 6 p.m. Can you speak to the reality that bishops? Oh, sorry, I'm looking at the wrong one. Yes, 551. I apologize. Would you be willing to comment on whether the central image of the church in both Johannine literature and Pauline literature, the church as the risen body of Christ, queers the person of Jesus by implying that while he was historically a human man, his risen presence is made concrete in history through disciples of all genders and no gender?
I would simply like to say, yes, what they said, right? One of the problems at the moment is that
might be a theologian who wrote that. We'll see.
I agree completely with the commenter. And I want to tie this a little bit implicitly to something that Dr. Butler has said and that maybe Ms. LeBlanc has implied. And so grateful for both of your presentations. And it's this. We don't only have authoritarianism at the moment. We have authoritarianism with the possibility of control, which is new in the history of the church because we have instantaneous communication. So there can be the effort to regularize and routinize theology. There can be an effort to make sure that everyone is on the same page politically. There can be an effort to either unanimously cover up the sexual abuse crisis or ensure that every single person, adult active in church ministries, has been trained in safe practices, right? So I think it's very interesting to think about the combination of the authoritarian aspiration and the possibility of instantaneous communication so that there's actually a degree of attempt to control in a way that was frankly impossible in an era in which you had to put a letter on a boat to cross an ocean or take a horse many days and possibly die in the attempt, right, to get a letter somewhere. So that may seem irrelevant here, but I think it's actually quite important to all three of our comments.
And for Stacie, a couple questions there. How do you see clergy sexual abuse relating to Catholic identity? And then a longer question about Pennsylvania, Australia, Ireland, that they continue to cover up even after the scandal broke in the news to move known abuses from parish to parish, putting countless more children at risk.
And my response to that, I don't go very often. I mean, I go to a very diverse church in New Orleans, and people there know what I do. And I get asked frequently, how can I come to church knowing what the priest did? And it's really interesting because it is almost like it's not okay to be a professional in my field and to study this and to also be a Catholic. And so I see the Catholic identity piece is a very big struggle. I know many people in my profession who were strong Catholics and just couldn't do it anymore. But I also believe that part of that ties into all of this is that the crisis within the church has driven many away and has left many remaining that are extremely conservative and will overlook the authoritarian pieces that moved molesting priests, molesters, I don't even like to use the word priest as it relates to them, but move them from diocese to diocese and look the other way. I have cried myself to sleep reading the reports of the Philadelphia grand jury. Dr. Shevlin and I both serve on the National Review Board, and we get many of the reports. Now, I've been doing this work 31 years. I've been to autopsies of children who were killed. I have been forensically interviewed. I put kids on the stand. I have seen some of the biggest atrocities committed to kids. But what I can tell you is that some of the cases, because it was allowed to go on and on unchecked, the level of aggression, the level of physical force, things we don't usually see. And so it is very, very difficult when you see how many people, and I don't want to, we need to also note there were nuns who knew what was going on too. And so we need to make sure that we understand that the entire system, it's a systematic failure, and we all have a role in it. And I think that we're all going to need to use our voices to amplify the voices of children and amplify the voices of the survivors in order to give them a path out for all of us.
Stacie, can I just make a comment about what you just said? Because I think it's really important. You were just talking about Philadelphia. I've read both Philadelphia when I got here and also read the grand jury, the report for the state of Pennsylvania, which was just horrible. I cannot begin to say to people how horrible the cases in that case were. And I think, one of the things that is important to say, because this is back to authoritarianism, and I've talked to and have had friends who have been abused by priests. And I think one of the things we need to say here is that our very theology brings us to this point of believing that people represent Jesus Christ on earth and that they can do these things. And so the dichotomy between what somebody is doing and what they are supposed to represent is broken. And that also really needs to be addressed. My first parish in LA, and there's somebody in the chat who knows about where I went. I did a service there with another faculty member to bring healing to that congregation, because there had been people who had been molested by this priest, but there were also people who were in love with this priest because he was popular. They loved him, but they were both in this healing ceremony about this. And so when somebody's asking me, how do we get these things fixed in the church? I think we got to come to the ground that we know about. We need to come at this, the beginning is, how do we deal with this in the way in which people's faith, can at least be sustained. And if it is broken irrevocably, then we need to understand what did that. Is not them hardening their hearts, but the abuse that happened to them, and that they need justice for that. So, in the Pennsylvania context, I've been sick of the fact that they've been fighting with the state to not let the statute of limitations go up. These are the kinds of things that are the injustices, and they are injustices that need to be addressed, and they're injustices that need to be dealt with. So I just want to thank you, for the work that you're doing, and to help people understand how really just difficult this is to be reading and hearing and dealing with people who have had this massive amount of not just physical sexual abuse, but spiritual abuse happen to them.
And thank you for commenting on that spiritual harm. It's real and it's recognized. And finally, we're getting the research to show the spiritual harm that's been done.
If I could chain on to something that Dr. Butler said, I'm so grateful for these comments, because I've worked actually a bit on child abuse myself, and also have an experience with the community that suffered from it. one point that I think has been made, and I just want to magnify, is that we're talking about clericalism and authoritarianism, but clericalism and authoritarianism don't exist simply in clergy. They exist in lay people.
Mhm.
Otherwise, the whole system would fall apart. And one of the points of this whole idea of synodality, which, by the way, a large number of members of the USCCB are resisting massively, is that all members of the church, and even people who have left it and may never have been members, are welcome to the table on par as equals, right? To discuss, to allow the Spirit to move. And lay people are going to have to undo their habits of clericalism, right? Because it's partly our fault that those have been maintained, that structure has been maintained. If we don't support it, it can't be there.
It's stunning how spontaneous it's there, how spontaneously it presents itself. So I believe a couple of students, this is for students, so let's put them in the center for a moment. From Jessica, will it ever be possible to end white fragility? And then from Gunnar, apologies if Gunnar is not a student, I think he is. Dr. Butler, could you please restate what you believe should be done about the problem of white supremacy in the church?
Okay, so the first one, can we get rid of white fragility? I don't know, ask white people. I mean, you know, this is where I come back on you and I say, that's not my problem to fix. That's your problem to fix. And if you're not white, that's great. But I like to always say to people, it's like, you can't just keep looking to the people who got done over and done wrong as the people who can fix everything, you know, because that's just not going to work, right? That's number one. And so the second question was, say that one to me again, about what do I think that the issue should be? How do we get rid of white supremacy in the church?
Correct.
Well, it's, you know, we talked about clericalism here, but, you know, maybe synodality will help us to talk about this, because I think we have to actually be able to express that it exists in the church. You know, I grew up in a time where it was, you know, post-Vatican II, and went to a predominantly white Catholic church, and there were people who did not want to shake my hand during the peace. Okay. This is the way it is. This is what I lived with as a Black Catholic, because already, you know, you're in some places like Texas, you're an anomaly. If you were in Louisiana, you wouldn't be, or Chicago or someplace else. But I mean, something as simple as somebody just shaking my hand during the peace and not turning away from me, you know, and that has happened to me, you know, time after time. And I think that this is the, you know, this is the thing that we have to start to deal with. We have to start to deal with this on a parish, personal, individual people level. What is it about that you cannot shake my hand during the passing of the peace in a place where Catholic C means the whole communion of Christ and all of this other stuff? You can't shake my hand. So how am I supposed to deal with the rest of this issue if I can't even get a white person to shake my hand, you know, during the mass? And this is where I throw these questions back at people, because I think what is normal for people to ask is this: well, how do we fix this? Because I talk about it. I'm like, I'm just here to bring the message. I'm John the Baptist. I am not Jesus. And Jesus didn't even fix it all, because basically look at how this has gone, right? You know, so I think we got to, you know, realize that it's up to us to start to look at ourselves in a way and say, where is this in effect in my life? Where am I dealing with white fragility? Where am I dealing with, you know, accepting these kinds of issues about white supremacy? I said on Twitter today, there was a clip from, I believe it was North Carolina Lieutenant Governor, who talked about, in this very kind of Christian militant way, about how we're going to have to fight for our freedoms and everything else. And I said, listen, white supremacy is not only about white people. It's about people who accept the premise of white supremacy, and they don't even have to be white. And so that's part of this problem. It's like, there are ways in which this becomes very insidious to all of us. And I think that, you know, I try to pay attention to Jesus, who he himself was not, you know, a person who was not, how shall I say this? Because it always scares everybody. If you think about the story of Jesus and the Syrophoenician woman, the Syrophoenician woman had to let Jesus know that he was a racist, because he didn't want to give her any food. And then she had to say, well, look, you know, the dogs are eating from this table. Why are you not giving me something? And that, that caused Jesus to pause. That woman charged Jesus up. And when we start to read scripture in that way and go, oh, wow, this is a different kind of story, then I think we can begin to see the ways in which we have to think about ourselves and what we are doing to help perpetuate these systems that are destroying all of us.
Maybe we could just stick with this for another moment. There's, I think, a helpful question about the USCCB pastoral letter from 2018, Open Wide Our Hearts, which immediately upon release was recognized by, I'd say, a comfortable majority of theologians to be conspicuously lacking input, especially from what we know from scholars who are specializing in this area from an historical, theological, ethical standpoint. And so that's at 5:35 this evening. The question, do you feel the bishop's refusal to engage in dialogue with a variety of, especially Black Catholic theologians, reflects how US Catholicism has been co-opted by American evangelicalism and white nationalism?
Yes, and yes. That's the simple answer. The more complex answer is that they don't want the criticism and they don't want to have to really dig deep. Because, quite frankly, for a lot of bishops, it is about maintaining the flock that they have, maintaining the relationships, financial and otherwise, that they've had. And so it's really important for them to keep that going as opposed to talking about, racism within the church or Black Lives Matter or any of that other stuff. And they would like to just kind of pawn this off to other people to do, and they could kind of tut and keep going. The issue is this, and it's not just about a Black-white issue here. I think this is a bigger issue about racism, because if we throw in how the bishops have been weird about how they're going to deal with, immigration and other kinds of issues that touch upon race, I think what we can see is their reticence to deal with anything except political expediency. And the crux issue of abortion has basically turned them into a moribund institution. I'm not sure what they do right these days. I'll be honest about that. I think that the bishops are not something that the lay people look to. And I take very seriously this comment about, clericalism. But the fact of the matter is that I don't, I'll be honest here and say it's very hard to respect most of the Conference of Catholic Bishops because they've been co-opted by the Republican Party. And it's okay if they have political beliefs. I don't care about that. As individuals, they can have those political beliefs. But when you see the bishops moving more in step with evangelicals who are kowtowing to Donald Trump, and when you see the cardinal in New York yucking it up with him, then I think that I have a problem in how I see the Conference of Bishops and their ability to talk across issues that are very important in the American church right now.
I think there's another piece to this, which both of you have alluded to in different ways, and that's money. And the COVID hasn't helped, right, with donations. And so people do not want to offend their cash cows.
Nope.
I think that this is an element of it. The other thing that I just want to drop in there is that I believe this is true. I believe that the conversations with theologians, and that's just one group of people the bishops could consult, right? This is just a litmus test, not a comprehensive comment. The bishops used to meet with representatives of the Catholic Theological Society of America every year or two to discuss theological issues and to share ideas and to be informed on both sides. They don't do that anymore. They called that off. And I'm sure that's not the only group of people they used to meet with that they no longer listen to. So,
yeah. But I think that also points to the fact that theology doesn't matter for them anymore. The politics matter more, you see.
Definitely feels that way.
Dr. Traina, there is a, maybe this can be a question that we might end our evening with. I know it's late for all of you, much more later for you than it is for me. But for Anthea and Cristina in particular, it's 9:30 almost. But the last question mentions, Dr. Traina, your you're kind of walking us through all the ways in which we can kind of recover a vision in the tradition of its queerness, of its both and. And then a kind of maybe a fix it kind of question. How can we actually translate that? How can we translate that optic on the tradition into what I take the question to be asking, the acceptance of the humanity of queer people? How do we make that transposition from theology, from seeing that kind of queer principle constantly reiterated throughout the tradition, to then valuing our queer brothers, sisters, friends, etc.
Just very, very briefly, first of all, with regard to public life, civic life, there's motion in the church at the moment. For instance, the idea that we could accept civil marriage, same-sex marriage, for instance. So there's some motion in the civic realm. In the church life realm, it is actually the case that theology often follows rather than drives practice. And so what I think is true is that we have to look to the places where this is active, where it's actually being done, and encourage that and build it up. Because there are plenty of places where it is at the ground level happening. So we just need to nurture those, I think. Not just, in addition to everything else, we need to nurture those.
Engage the process. Okay. Any final parting words of wisdom, words of encouragement?
Well, I'll leave with St. Ignatius. Don't make any decisions in desolation. And I'm hoping we're not in desolation right now, but I think that we do need to consider where we are as a church and try to think about what our real identity is. I think about this a lot, and I think about the reasons why I have chosen to stay despite a lot of things, and why I still consider myself to be a Catholic. Maybe it was because of a praying grandmother, I don't know, a mother who prays the rosary every day, that could be it. But I also think it's about the people of God and trying to understand where we're going and what we're doing. And that is a very mixed bag right now. And I don't look to leadership to do that. I look towards the people who are sitting with me on either side of the pew and hope that we can get together and make something better of this than it is right now.
Absolutely. All of this sort of critical energy and commentary is coming from within the Catholic context. I mean, so none of us are walking away. We're sticking in, and we're making effort where effort can be made. So viewers and listeners should know that we are insiders, not outsiders poking holes. We are insiders. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Cristina Traina, Dr. Anthea Butler, Ms. Stacie LeBlanc. Extremely grateful for your comments this evening. Our Department of Religious Studies values these conversations immensely. Your voices are valued immensely. We hope people down the camera value this as well, and that especially for our students, that some work in their courses is being done right now, ways in which they might be able to build bridges across this event and different courses that they might be taking, different professors that they might be having, different majors that they might be studying. So to them, we wish them all good things, and to everyone else in this discussion, thank you so much for your participation, for your comments, for your questions. Please know that the spring Flannery Lecture, we are intending it to happen in real time, live here on campus. Dr. Natalia Imperatori Lee of Manhattan College, March 30th in the new year, March 30th, 2022, here in Hemmingson Ballroom. So please stay tuned for more advertisement and notification of that event. But this Flannery webinar will be posted on our departmental website in due course, probably within 2 weeks. For students who might need to revisit a comment or two from our esteemed speakers, please know within 1 to 2 weeks, it should be available for you at the Department of Religious Studies website. So without further ado, have a wonderful evening. Happy All Saints Day, All Souls Day, and we will see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.